All right, let's do this one. Why was it a big deal that there were any female academics in the 1970s? Let's look at one story as a means to illustrate why whiteness was behind it rather than blackness. No, really. Okay? Again, I'm not going to speak for country here. Okay? Acknowledging that Australia is made up of about 400 different countries, not one. Can't speak for any or all of them. Just can provide the information that's available. This information works a bit like this. In the 1800s, anthropologists were coming from Europe to the continent now known as Australia, in some cases to document the tribes there, and in one case, a couple of male anthropologists had gone to a tribe, we won't say which one, and they had been told that they weren't allowed to talk to the women. They were taken to a men's camp. They were tribally initiated to learn the ways of the tribe, and then they went back to Europe and published their paper, and they proclaimed that the women were kept women who were so disenfranchised by the controlled behaviour of the black men that they weren't even allowed to talk to those men. Okay? This is coming from an 1800s European before the British Common Law Courts in 1873 said women could even speak as their own witness in court. Okay, because of ecclesiastical law. Okay, fair enough. Now, what is a non-white perspective or a potential non-white perspective on that interaction? Well, the answer is that those women would have had their own country potentially and their own camps and their own law, and it would have been considered tribal law more generally for the men to not have a say in it. That the men were expected to take care of their own law business and the women theirs, and the men were not allowed to tell the women what to do, nor were the women allowed to tell the men what their law was. And because the anthropologists were men, of course, they weren't allowed to go to women's camp and be initiated on the women's law. And so these strange little ideas came out of that, which we don't even know if it's truthful or not because of the history of the situation. We don't know if it's truthful to argue that women were kept women in pre-colonial Australia. We don't actually know. What we do know is that some of the anthropologists that were documenting tribal behaviour were doing so through the lens of what's now called cultural myopia, which means they were seeing that tribe through their own cultural lens. Even after they'd been initiated, they still saw things through the lens of where they'd come from, not necessarily where they were at the time. Okay? It might have actually been the case is if those anthropologists had traipsed onto women's country or women's camp, they could have been hit with a Noah. We don't know. Those women could have been very strong, and in the sense of the way they expressed that was, no guys allowed. We don't need you telling us what to do, but they might have done it that way. We don't know. There's an assumption that the clever people, for example, one of the assumptions that come out of that is that if you don't know what a clever person is, basically a wizard, okay? The clever person is another word for wizard. We use that generic term because the word shaman was ripped off from the ANU, has been overused, okay? We can't use a culturally specific term, so we won't. We'll just say wizard, which technically is a European word anyway, so apologies to Europeans for that one. One of the assumptions the anthropologists made was wizards or clever people were men only. They assumed that the clever people were only men and that the women were kept cloistered off in their camps, unallowed to talk to strangers. That sounds like Europe. In Europe, a woman wasn't allowed to have her own camp unless it was a convent. If she tried to have her own camp without any guys allowed, outside of a convent, she was likely to be assumed to be a witch and could have been burnt at the stake. In Europe and in England until 1873, she wasn't allowed to even fucking speak her own testimony in court. She required 2 male witnesses, just like the Bible says. It's presumptuous to think that, quote-unquote, blackness was behind women's subjugation in ancient Australia. It's bloody presumptuous. We don't actually fucking know. We do know that the idea of a 50-year-old man having a third or fourth wife who was, 15 or 16 years old was probably common practice. We also know that until about 1950, the global survival rate of people over the age of 50 pretty much didn't happen. So he would have been classified as a good hunter who could look after them. And also, 15 is a far more acceptable age, despite its limitations and issues, for being considered an adult than, say, 12. Let's look at some of the marriage customs in Europe as it was in the 1800s. You had 30-year-old men being betrothed to 8-year-olds. You had the same dowry system becoming slightly less practiced than before, but nonetheless still there, that they now claim the Middle Eastern people are uber sexist for continuing to do. They had under ecclesiastical law at the time that the 30-year-old couldn't touch the 8-year-old, otherwise they were going to get strung. And they did. Yeah, they did. At least they had that. At least they had that. Why, these days, if you were part of a pedophile ring, you'd become the president of the USA. So, it's a little bit disturbing, isn't it? Just quietly, did the women who were sent off to be with their husbands that they didn't get to choose, kept women maybe? With the women, when they were expected to only be in the house at home, mopping the floors and doing their ironing like the women of Australia are known to do, were there by any chance kept women? When they were prevented from hanging around with other women, unless they should have a hen clucking circle where they, were they by any chance kept women? When they weren't allowed to get the same education as men, and then later on when university education happened, they were only ones that were allowed to go up to 10th grade because the guys went to work after 6th grade. And, of course, from grade 6 to 10, their education was cooking and sewing. Were they perhaps kept women then? When they were denied access to the academia. When Hypatia was murdered for being an academic in ancient Greece, were they kept women then? When Aristotle was from a long line of ancient Greek thinkers who said women didn't even have souls, Well, they kept women back then. Were they kept women when they were burnt at the stake for living past the age of 35 and not being a mother and not being died of plague? Were they kept women then? Did their whiteness have anything to do with that? I don't know. Ancient Greeks are sort of associated with Minoans. Minoans and the ancient Greeks sort of intermarried, and before that the Minoans were intermarrying with the northern Egyptians, who had a mixture of Syrians and Nubians there. So maybe ancient Greeks are kind of, they might actually be, I don't know, brown people. Maybe the ancient Greeks were brown people. They weren't completely white. They weren't Saxon enough. It's like those Habuno people. There's a horrible black tribe Habuno people, who came from Iberia and before that, northern Egypt, during the Hyksos kings. It seems that those people were not white before they got there. Anyway, just quietly, were they kept women then? Is there any sexism in the idea that the banshee's a female? Just quietly, why should a banshee be a female, not a male? Is there any sexism in Kabbalah to say that Lilith is a child killer and the mother of all demons because she refused to bow down to Adam? Does that represent a kept woman, maybe? Don't know. Is a kept woman someone who's allowed to have her own country, her own territories with a sisterhood, have her own bloody laws, and if any bloke gives her fucking grief, she can whack him over the head? Oh, wait. And if she happens to have a clever people in her mix, the men don't get to know about it. Only the black women were kept women. Margaret Allen's blackness was the reason why she couldn't get in the academia. It had nothing to do with Germaine Greer's whiteness, did it?